Welcome to our Labor Day installment of Mirza Musings, and we are so excited to welcome the amazing Jen Henderson, CEO and founder of TiLT. TiLT is an easy-to-use platform that makes workplace leaves easy, streamlined, safe, successful, and we met Jen out of our shared mission to close the gender pay gap. So it's pretty incredible to see how different founders are tackling this very big issue.
I'm really excited to be here. I could talk about this all day long.
Awesome. Well, to get started, why don't you just give a bit of an intro about you, your background, and then what drove you to start TiLT?
Yeah, happy to. So my professional background primarily was in corporate America. I spent 15 years in Fortune 500 companies in a variety of operational roles. And in that time, I really pressed hard and fast on my career. So accelerated pretty quickly, promoted often. And then I had my first child and quite literally stopped getting invited to the table that I had become so accustomed of being a part of. And it was devastating to me as someone who really tied her identity to her career success. I just couldn't quite connect the dots as to why having a child resulted in a significant downshifting in my career trajectory. I turned the other cheek at the time. I was just really excited. I'd fought for 7 years through in vitro to get pregnant, so I was just so happy to be pregnant. And then fast forward 5 years, different company, different stage of my career. And at this time, when I became pregnant with my second child, I actually had a promotion rescinded when I announced the news. And that was the breaking point for me to realize this is really unfair and not right, and leave and this perception of caregivers at work was broken. So I made the jump into entrepreneurship and started TiLT 3 years ago. We just turned 3 in July. And in a lot of those early days, I needed to understand the problem at its most minor detail and its most granular level. And I did a lot of that research abroad. So no surprise, the US is significantly behind the rest of the industrialized world when it comes to supporting leave and caregivers and moms and dads. So I did a lot of research. How does what I experienced show up for all the other stakeholders involved? HR, managers, organizations, society, and then we started building from there. And TiLT today is doing really well. We've been in market selling for just about a year and having some really great progress.
I mean, there's so many things in that. I mean, it sounds like, unfortunately so familiar about all the stories that we listen to about how women kind of are edged out of the workforce after a certain point in time, but especially for you, like, accelerating so quickly, having to go through a really emotional process with IVF while doing that, and then having kind of these barriers and just these like roadblocks. I mean, sounds like it must have been pretty hard to get through.
Yeah, it was no walk in the park. First of all, IVF, I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemy. It was the most gut-wrenching, emotional, physical time of my life. And how my husband and I honestly survived that, I think, is still a miracle to this day because it was so hard. And with the career implications, I was naive, and I find a lot of people are in terms of the long-term ramifications. I'll always remember to the day that I die, I was sitting in a seminar in the Galvanize in Boulder. You guys may have been there, 28th Street, all right, near there. Anyway, I was listening to this woman. It was something about women in the workplace, the seminar, and she said a statistic that women who opt out of the workforce for anything more than 2 years to do caregiving of any capacity will incur a 30 to 40% earning reduction over their lifetime. And I remember distinctly, my hand shot up and I said, "Can you please repeat that statistic and cite your source?" And she did, and it's from Sheryl Sandberg's work with Lean In, and that was it. That was me to say how complete and total bullshit that is, that I was the primary breadwinner in our family for a long, long time, and because I was biologically built to have a child meant that my career trajectory and financial implications, 30 to 40%, that was it. I mean, just no, just no. And I couldn't stomach my kids eventually encountering that level of discrimination, bias, and unfair process and practice. And so they're my, reason I get up and do this every day is I've got a clock. I've got 15 years till my kids enter the workforce to fix this. And yeah, we're fighting every day. But to your point, those stories of women and men going through very similar experiences, and not just parental, all sorts of leave discrimination, that's our fuel. Every single day we get a story like that, and that keeps us fighting as fast and hard as we can.
Yeah. I love that you have like the 15-year kind of deadline for yourself. I think that's really powerful to just make a better world for your kids, which is great. And yeah, the 30 to 40% statistic is just so disheartening, especially when you hear that like fathers actually get a 6% bump when they have kids, and you're just like, how is this possible? But I think that that's actually a great segue to just kind of, do you mind just giving a little bit more detail about what TiLT actually is doing? And, we know what you're tackling and the problems, but do you mind just explaining how it works a little bit more?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So TiLT, we are coined a leave administrator, which I have to be honest, I don't love that association, because leave administration historically is such a cold, archaic, and process-oriented system. And leave administrators are cold and archaic and antiquated. So I don't self-associate with that type of, it's semantics, but it's a big deal to me. We really are a leave alignment solution, is what I like to say. And so how that shows up in the technology is we're a web-based application or software that an employer purchases for their HR benefits stack. When there's a leave, whether FMLA qualifying or not, that organization invites the employee who's going to be going out on the leave into the TiLT technology to go through an intake process. We generate a plan for them that essentially walks them through every single step of the before, during, and after the leave. What forms need to be filed, we do that, right? There is compliance components, but I call those our Trojan horse, because once we get all that stuff out of the way and the boxes checked and the T's crossed and I's dotted, that's where TiLT really comes alive. And that's where we're able to support that employee with, what do you need to know? If you're going out on a parental leave, especially a first time, what are your rights and responsibilities? What can your manager say and not say legally? What is your role and responsibility? And then even having a resource library available of what are the cost implications, and we have a budget calculator for them to look through, or this is where a partnership library is being built, which we're really excited about. How are they thinking through what kind of birth they want to have? If it's a COVID-19 leave, actually, this is kind of a funny offshoot, not funny, but topical. When COVID really hit its height in March, my husband is a firefighter paramedic and contracted COVID-19. So he came home, was waiting on the test. We got the call that it was positive. He had kissed all of us, said, hello, I'm back from shift. So we all went into quarantine for 2 weeks. So I will never forget sitting in my home office with the TiLT team in this war room when COVID had hit its peak, and the legislation was passed forcing companies under 500 employees to administer leaves literally overnight. Like overnight, these companies had to say, oh, sure, you have a COVID-19 leave. So we had to build the support within TiLT to do that. So I'm sitting there in the war room with my team. My husband's upstairs, literally fighting off fevers, battling COVID-19. And so I was able to see, how is his employer supporting us and him going through that? What is this like as a spouse of someone going through? And we just chucked out all these resources and processes. So it was a, hindsight 2020, awesome experience to be able to go through and then kick out these resources. But back to the technology, that's an example of, in today's state, if you go through a leave, it's a peanut butter spread, one size fits all, file your forms, go out on leave, do what you need to do and come back. In a TiLT leave, it's file your forms, get that done. And then what do you need? You're on a COVID-19 leave? Great. Here's some resources. Here's some best practices. Here's some communities you can go to. Here's some educational materials to make that personal for you and make it beneficial and make it human. Like how leave has been so dehumanized is mind-boggling to me. And that's really what we're working to bring back. And then the last thing I'll say is that everything that I just went through for how it supports an employee, we do exactly the same thing for managers. We know through research and experience, if managers do not have a critical key role in a leave, that is the highest risk point for a leave going sideways, for an employee becoming disengaged, and for them to not come back and stay after the leave. So we are the only solution in the market that pulls the manager through in the same form function as the employee. And at our heart and soul, the core of why and how we're doing what we're doing is those managers have to be involved and they have to be educated. So we support them as well.
Jen, I love this so much. The human approach and super empathetic approach to this very high stress legal process is wonderful. And I can say firsthand in previous roles as a manager, it's so easy to just get caught up in what is the process and what are the things that I can do, what do I need to do, and how to manage the business operations while someone is out. And then at the same time, we had these managing within the law trainings, and I knew there were all of these things that I wasn't allowed to know, things I wasn't allowed to say, but the lines of where that was always really blurred because I didn't really remember any of it. And so there's always this anxiety as well as a manager that it's important for me to provide an open space to talk, to listen and just be there for you. But I also don't know if I'm supposed to know some of the medical histories that can put folks in hot water. So I'm sure there are just so many questions that I was too afraid to answer and would just punt to HR and felt like a terrible human being because I couldn't actually be there. So I would love if you could share how you and your team tackle this really, really complicated area. So from just all of the legislation, all of the forms to creating a very streamlined, easy process for employees, and then how managers get to experience being able to just support their teams.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the easiest example to point to is TurboTax. If you've ever gone through that user experience, it takes a really complex, heavy jargon, fear-inducing process, and it really just like click on this button if you don't understand. Here's your information, and just really streamlines a gross process. We do a lot of the same form function. When we ingest a policy or some sort of a internal handbook that is often very jargony and written legally heavy, we digest that and we translate it. And our COO is actually a labor and employment attorney. And so her ability to say, this is what this means, this is layman's terms, this is stupid and we don't need to include this. Like she has that domain expertise to help us in that translation ability first and foremost, and bringing the software in to do a lot of that as well, right? So the data ingestion that we're doing and subsequent creation of the steps has built into it a lot of that simplifying language. And then the other component of that is it's always changing. So the law, and 8 states have passed paid leave legislation, and they change like all the time. So again, being able to immediately update those steps within a TiLT plan is a huge value add to our clients. But you said something really poignant that I want to double click on in regards to the manager walking into those conversations, not knowing what to expect, not knowing how to field questions. One of the biggest problems in my experience in enterprise, as well as what we've seen through the research, is these annual trainings or these consultants that come in, or the lunch and learns, kind of insert whatever it is that you've experienced in there. It's proven to not be effective because there's no application of that learning right after the training most of the time, right? So you go through, and I love that example, the managing through the law type of the curriculum. Great information in the moment, like awesome, I got my notebook, but 6 months goes by, and then I go into a leave conversation. What exactly did I learn? And that's where, again, really leaning into the trends around education, bite-sized education, video education, under 2 minutes, that type of inclusion within the technology of TiLT, really being able to arm the managers. You're going into, you have it in your hand, in your phone, you're going into a conversation about flexible work arrangements with your employee who's going to go on a leave. Really quickly, here's what you need to know, right? Here's what your policy in your organization gives you the guardrails for. Here's legally what your guardrails are. And here's some best practices of sentence starters, of questions, of deeper conversations, of probes and things like that. And then when you're actually in the conversation, allowing the space for a manager to say, hold on, let me check. I don't know the answer to that question, and self-serve, right? In their TiLT app right there. We've got to get away from this assumption that managers are the subject matter experts of everything that they're responsible for. It's just insane. And number two, HR does not have the bandwidth, does not have the people, just doesn't have the scope to be able to be there at the level that they want to support those conversations and those people. So we've got to turn to technology, which we found people really want. They want to be able to self-serve. They want to be able to access that on their own. So I think your example is right on, and definitely something that we're pulling into the technology and seeing really nice adoption on.
That's so good to hear. Seriously, from experience, I wish I had that. Thank you for building that.
Yeah, we're working as fast as we can because we hear that a lot.
I think what really stuck out to me from what you just said is that 8 states have paid maternity or like paid leave now. And I do think it's worth us mentioning that, like, of all of the like OECD countries in the world, the US is the only one that doesn't have mandated paid maternity leave, just a blanket statement. But I think something you kind of tie into that too is, you know, you started kind of focusing on parental leave, but you're now covering all kinds of leave. So, you know, sick leave, like COVID leave, disability leave, long-term disability, everything like that. Do you mind sharing just some interesting history that you wish folks knew about the different types of leave like available, and just kind of how they all came to be?
In the macro level of the country, or how we've kind of evolved with supporting our leaves?
Yeah, in just some interesting pieces of history about the US legislation, and anything interesting that you think people should know more about.
Yes, it's a great question, and I wish I could phone a friend and call in Kate, because she could wax poetic on this all day long. She's my COO that's an attorney. FMLA legislation is not that old in regards to protecting, so job protected leave, which is 12 weeks, and an organization over 50 employees in a certain geographical area, they have to allow 12 weeks of job protected leave. That is not paid. So anytime somebody has a leave qualifying event, which means parental is the easiest, there's no argument that that's something that FMLA covers, but some of the other disability or life events that may lead to an FMLA, there's a whole litany of qualifying events that lead to that. But when it is an approved FMLA leave, you get 12 weeks. It's either in a calendar year, so January to January, or an organization can denote when their start stop 12-month rotation is. So it could potentially be a fiscal year or something like that. The key being that it's not paid. So that's fine that somebody, and yes, there are times when it's really truly a lifesaver to have 12 weeks that your job is insulated, but very few people that I know can afford to take 12 weeks of unpaid leave. And financially, that's devastating. So the history of leave in the US is embarrassing, in my opinion, and has led to a lot of the gender disparity we see in organizations, has led to a lot of societal impacts. It's a really, really noisy topic right now. We have seen COVID advance caregiving conversations. It's really brought what we thought was going to be the next 5 years of evolution into the last 5 months. And that's awesome, but I'm also often quoted as saying these days that COVID brought caregiving out of the closet and it's not going back in. You can't ignore kids running behind Zoom calls anymore. You can't ignore the fact that people are having to share that they're caring for elderly parents at the same time of school-age kids. It's just, we've gotten this huge spotlight on caregiving and the problems with caregiving. Now the real work begins with how are we going to fix this moving forward? And when we talk at the legislative level of, to your question, what's been done and what could be done, it's a really, really, really complex problem that I don't have a silver bullet to. I don't envy our lawmakers trying to figure this out, but I will say, one of the female founders who's my like rock star, I would put a poster of her on my wall if I could, is Jen Hyman of Rent the Runway. So she is known for saying again and again and again that Rent the Runway is not a clothing company, it's not a subscription company, it's a data company. They know more about every single skirt, shirt, pant than anyone else on the planet, more than the designers, the manufacturers, the retailers. They are that repository of data, and that's their power. That's their secret sauce. We absolutely feel TiLT is that exact same methodology. We have the ability to be the repository and data collection of everything leave related, not only in the US, but in the world, because we were called as expert testimony last year to the Polis administration here in the state of Colorado. Governor Polis stood up a task force to pass paid leave here in the state of Colorado. They called us as expert testimony. Great, awesome, we came and talked to these brilliant people. But I became acutely aware that this legislation is being passed in these states and eventually the federal government with a complete void of data. There is no one that's providing these decision makers data to make these decisions and pass these laws, in my opinion, the right way. It's anecdotal. It's a lot of subjective interpretation of the other states that have passed it. They need the data that we are building the software to ingest and eventually be able to push out. So what circling back to the question of where has the country come, it's not great, but where we can go, where TiLT really wants to insert what we're collecting in data is really exciting. We have the absolute right tailwinds, the absolute right macro conversations to make systemic change. And we're inserting ourselves, our company, and our voice as fast and hard as we can in those legislative conversations. So partnering with Plus organization, with Good Business Colorado, with really every entity that is pushing paid leave. It's inhumane in my opinion. And the last statistic I'll leave you with here, and then I'll stop talking about this. 1 in 4 women return to work 10 days after giving birth. And it's inhumane. Anyone who's gone through or knows the details of the physical process of bringing life into this world, 10 days, because financially they have no other choice, it's embarrassing for this world, or for this country, just embarrassing. So we are fighting as fast as we can to make that change as well.
Well, we absolutely hope to be on that same fight really soon, and love the approach to getting the data that's actually needed to drive strong policy. That's really what we're looking to do too. And what you've said about that statistic is heartbreaking. It reminds me of recently we saw a California legislator have to return to work to vote because she couldn't vote remotely. Just having given birth is apparently not a reason for it. And it's really, really at once horrifying to see and to hear the stories, to see the statistics, but at the same time so inspiring that there are people like you that we're going to fight really freaking hard to make change.
Yeah, my COO was always quoted as saying, we'll die on this hill if we have to, because you can't turn the other cheek anymore. It's just crazy. And it's going to take an army of us. It is absolutely going to take an army of us.
Yeah. And so for Labor Day, we would love if we can talk through some of the employment protections that do exist. So you mentioned FMLA. Could you share around the process of starting a family? So there's the 12 weeks of FMLA leave. What are the largest categories of federal employment protections? And besides FMLA, what are some of the limitations as well?
Oh, it's a great question. And the sad answer is there's not a lot out there. So outside of FMLA, what somebody going on a leave could potentially have available to them is all employer dependent or state dependent. So if you talk employer dependent singularly, there's often, especially with larger organizations, the ability to tap into short-term and long-term disability providers. That's typically an opt-in benefit that a lot of people, when they get hired, don't know or don't consider long-term. So sometimes that's not even an option, but that's one. The other is there are companies who have chosen to operate outside of the parameters of FMLA and not outside of the parameters, above and beyond, meaning they are actually going to pay where the government isn't and pay for those 12 weeks or 6 weeks or some component of that time off. So those are really what we see in the employer field at a big rock level. We could talk all day about how some of the other outside of the box solutions are starting to emerge and getting really creative, which is, we love to see that. And we're quickly pulling together all those different ideas for benchmarks. And then you see the federal side or the state side, the ability for if somebody's going to encounter a leave, depending on what state you're in, because all 8 of them do it differently. All 8 of them have different payout schedules, have different payment into the bank, so to speak, processes. How they're structured within the state is different. What employer contributions is different. So you can see really quickly why HR is like, here you go, TiLT, like you deal with this. I don't want to, it's really, really cumbersome. So if you're lucky enough to be in a state that has that, you do have the ability to opt into those. There's all sorts of rules, regulations, processes, and qualifications. And then as I mentioned earlier, your FMLA job protected time. But again, you have to work at a company of size to qualify for that. And there is a very large majority of the US working class that don't work at companies that are that small. And there's also a very large part of the working class that's working in the gig economy. And that is a whole nother ball of wax in terms of how leave shows up for those individuals. The short answer is it doesn't. And it's really, really sad to see how leave impacts individuals in a gig capacity.
Yeah, I used to work in a restaurant, and I like, even just for like vacation or if you get sick, it's so hard because you don't get paid that day. So there's so much that that can happen on a short-term basis, where most people, like, you get a couple of weeks of vacation a year or whatever it is, and you kind of consider that a given. But if you're in the gig economy, it just goes out the window. And then you think about the fact that a lot of those people might not have great insurance or other things that would make something like this easier. And it just kind of spirals. So it's so hard. And then I know you said like FMLA is an option in the 8 states that offer paid leave. You have that. What about, like, what do people do in the states that don't have paid leave? Like, what does, or like, for maternity or whatever, like, what does that look like?
It's 100% determined by their employer. And if they're not employed, if it's a stay-at-home mom, nothing. You look at the other countries in the world, they would get government subsidized stipends of some sort for a certain amount of time. But caregiving has been forever and always viewed in this country as not real work, not valued work, not something that's recognized in any sort of a fiduciary responsibility capacity. So, and anyone who's been a stay-at-home mom, I tried, and it's the hardest job I've ever done, and I absolutely bombed at it. And I am in complete admiration and awe of women who do it, because it's 100%, 24 hours a day, no vacation time, no sick time, thankless coworkers. It's really, really, really hard. So yeah, the answer to the question is it depends on the employer. 100%.
Yeah, I love that. Thankless coworkers. I do think the one kind of silver lining of COVID is that everyone has kind of been forced into being that stay-at-home parent. So I think that that realization is that, like, you actually do have to, like, people have just been surrounded by their kids, even if they weren't previously. And we were speaking with someone else who homeschools her kids normally. And she was like, yeah, all of my friends are like, I don't know if I like my kids that much because they're just not used to spending this much time with them. But my hope is that because it's such at the forefront of so many people's minds and so many parents' minds now, that like we actually can get that policy change, because I think a lot of people will start pushing for it within their organizations. Hopefully there's so many legislators who probably were just trapped at home with their kids too. So hopefully it does actually, it's a catalyst for people to really have it be top of mind. And then with companies like TiLT to actually like make those changes.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And COVID has actually been very positive in a lot of capacities in this conversation of what you shared, as well as we're seeing hopeful more equal distribution of household responsibilities. And what that, in a perfect world, will lend itself to is more prevalence of parental as opposed to maternity and paternity leave. The research is very, very, very clear that the number one way that we're going to reduce our current 208 years until we hit gender parity in the workplace projections, which gag me, is the number one way we're going to accelerate that is by equalizing parental leave and having men actually take the same amount of time, the same structure and flexible work arrangement as women. And that is systematically going to reduce the disproportionate perception of women in the workplace, of particularly moms, and the penalties, the financial career trajectory penalties. So anytime we get a company come into TiLT and we're doing the ingestion of their policy, we will always make the recommendation, if there is a differentiation between primary or secondary or maternity or paternity leave, we will recommend, we're not counsel, that's not our job, but recommend strongly with research to show why it should just be a parental leave policy.
Yeah, I mean, we completely agree on that front. Have you seen, because I think in the Scandinavian countries, it's like a take it or leave it policy, which has really kind of pushed men to actually taking it more, whereas in other instances, you might have a fully equal parental leave policy, but the like secondary caregivers just aren't really taking it as much. Have you seen any kind of take it or leave it policies come through, or has it been across the board just trying to equalize?
I'm not going to remember the Scandinavian country specifically, but there is an example of you have to take it essentially. So they've created the structure where if the men don't elect to exhaust their parental leave allocation, the mom also sees a reduction, I think, in her time. So they're very interdependent, and that's where they've seen the acceleration of the usage because it's a penalizing type structure. That I've not seen at all in the US, and I don't know that that's the silver bullet. But to your point, where we see the greatest utilization of paternity leave is number one, where there's role modeling at a senior level, and they have a culture of embracing caregiving needs. So they're very open and have a systematic approach to, I'm leaving early back in the days of picking up my kid from school or soccer games, and they don't hide that, right? My kid's got a school play, and that's just built into the DNA of those organizations. So that's probably the largest influence on the utilization of those. But it's a problem because even the companies that we see offering parental or paternity leave, if there's a stigma, which most of the time there is, or fear of career implications, they're just not taking it. Men just aren't taking it. So it really is much, much more than slap a policy in a handbook and call it good. And we say that all the time to companies. That is the ticket to entry. Like, yes, write a great policy. And that doesn't mean a long policy. People often mistake TiLT from being advocates of, you should have 3, 6, 9 month parental leave time off. That's not what we advocate for. Again, we advocate for alignment of leaves. But that policy and whatever that is just the beginning. That is just the start to having a great experience for your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's like highlighting the data that like even 1 month of paternity leave like improves the balance in this home so much. Like there's just so many positive statistics about when men stay home and like get to be dads. And I think it's just like a really cool lobbying opportunity. Like you get to be a dad, so many men like in past generations didn't have, like they really didn't have that opportunity. And so I think if we frame it as like a really cool positive thing, then maybe we have to like create some kind of loss aversion for men to feel like they're losing this chance to be a dad. But
totally.
Well, I think that is most of the questions that we had. Thank you so much for talking with us today. Like, I mean, this is, again, I think we could both all agree that this is the kind of stuff we want to talk about all the time, and that we do talk about all the time. Before we like close off anything, is there anything else that you'd like to share? Any last minute comments or thoughts?
That's a tough question. I'm always asked it, and I could go on and on and on. I would just say that I would encourage anyone in a position of power to advocate for change and initiate change, and certainly reach out to us if there's any need for resources for kind of boilerplate how to influence. And then anybody that's not potentially in a position of power, to ask for it, to ask for changes, to create a case, to advocate for yourself. And again, we're more than happy to help arm people with that type of information and the ROI and case studies. We can come at it from any angle we need to. So that would just be it, right? So be an advocate for changing the narrative, and we're here to help.
That is wonderful and inspiring. And thank you again for joining us, Jen, and sharing all of this knowledge, sharing what you do. And we are so thrilled and excited to work together on this mission.
Back at you. Like I said, it's going to take an army, and the army that I'm seeing assemble is some absolutely amazing people. So yeah, thrilled. One day at a time.
one day at a time.